Welcome back, radio entrepreneurs, listeners, and fans. I'm producer Nathan Gobes, filling in for Jeffrey Davis this morning. Excited to have Marc Furman of Tarlow, Hart, and Rodgers and Marc Z of Marc Z Legal Staffing hosting this interview for us today. Welcome, Marks.
Great to be here, Nathan. Thank you.
Great to be here and looking forward to hearing from my partner, Mike Radin, excellent corporate lawyer, M&A lawyer.
Yes, of course. Well, Marc, you've let the cat out of the bag on our next guest.
Sorry.
That's all right.
Sorry.
It's all right. Our next guest, as you mentioned, Michael Radin, partner at Tarlow, Hart, and Rodgers. Welcome, Mike.
Good morning, Nathan. Good morning, Mark.
Morning, Mike. Great to see you. Thanks for coming on the show.
Well,
Thank you.
Marc Furman, I think I'll hand it over to you for the first question, if you'd like.
Sure. Well, Mike, you're a corporate M&A lawyer. Why is there so much interest right now in owners selling their companies?
So it's a great question, Mark. And, I think there's probably four major issues going on here. The first is just demographics. The baby boomer generation's getting older. And as people age, they start thinking about, what do I want to do when I am not running the business? People might take a hard look internally to their family and determine whether or not there's family members who want to and are capable of taking over the business. And if not, then what does that mean in terms of selling? Number two, there's lots of investable cash out in the marketplace right now. This is in the hands of both strategic buyers and private equity firms. Each of those has different pressures to deploy the capital in different ways for their own growth or returns for their investors. The third reason right now is that debt is very inexpensive and it's very covenant light. Banks want to go out and lend money. Interest rates are unbelievably low. We're getting a bit of a surge in inflation, which has been dormant for quite some time. There's a lot of different reasons for that. But when you have lots of equity and debt floating around, that tends to drive up demand, drive up prices. And that leads to the fourth issue, which is sort of built up demand, which is a combination of demographics, the fact that the pandemic has kind of dragged on a bit. And then there's sort of a shift in targets in terms of what companies are in favor. Media companies, maybe if they're digital media, are still pretty hot. But things like supply chain and logistics, which were considered boring, are suddenly white hot. So those are sort of the four things I see in talking to clients who are either sellers or buyers as to what's driving demand.
The other thing I'm finding, just in terms of my business, Mike, and you can obviously add in on this, is when you talk about the baby boomers, I think there are a lot of owners that wanted maybe a 5 to 10 year more window to stay in what they're doing. And now they're getting tapped on the shoulder, or they've gone during this period of time and saying, you know what, maybe now is the time, as opposed to waiting. Are you finding that you sort of like that 5 to 10 years that a lot of people put in terms of their timeline to sell a business are now, it's being ramped up now to the present because of what's been going on?
So, Mark, good question. I was having closing dinners with two different clients, neither of whom was doing a sale transaction. We were doing sort of a strategic investment for them or restructuring their debt. And each of them independently said that they are fielding 4 or 5 calls a week, unsolicited, from potential buyers. This is oftentimes driven by private equity firms that are trying to source deals, or investment bankers putting books out on the street. So yes, there are people who say, I didn't think that I'd be ready to sell or I'd ever want to sell. Maybe 5 or 10 years, I think about it. Depending on whether they're working with a wealth advisor, they may have a plan in terms of how much cash they want to build up. So they were thinking 5 or 10 years out in order to build a company to sufficient scale. But right now, the multiples can be insane if you have a good business. What I often think about when I hear that from clients is that, are they being active or are they being reactive? If the market's coming to you because somebody might want to buy you, that's obviously reactive. are you going to get the highest and best value and the best terms from someone like that versus going to the market and actively positioning the company where you want it to be, including after doing cleanup that every company can use to be more attractive as a target.
Interesting.
Mike, you've represented people who have bought and sold numerous number of businesses, but you've also represented people who are selling their baby, their business, probably for the first and only time in their life. And with regard to sellers who've never been through this before, what are some of the things they've learned and need to learn, about this process?
It's a good question, Mark. There's kind of two different buckets for that, and we try and talk with clients early in the process if they've involved us early. The first is that our clients often say to us after a closing that they did not appreciate how much time it takes to go through the process. And there is indeed a process to these transactions. The process will start obviously with a letter of intent, which comes about because hopefully you have multiple bids for the company and you can set out some basic terms, including, how much is going to be held back and other things like that. But once you've signed a letter of intent with someone, there's a long process that comes that sort of breaks out into three different buckets. There's the financial piece up front where quality of earnings gets tested and looked at very carefully to see if the purchase price sort of makes sense and how robust are the seller's accounting systems and books. Secondly, after the quality of earnings analysis per se is going to be a deeper dive into accounting, because that's going to provide the due diligence phase and information for the buyer, where the buyer really starts kicking the tire and getting in the weeds to see how clean is this business, what kind of risks do they have relative to other targets I might be looking at. Is this really an attractive company? And then the third and final stage is the legal stage, which is documentation, which is the last of sort of three stages. It's also the most detailed and the one where sellers are already exhausted from the first two phases of financial and due diligence. And now you want to go into the guts of a document and a disclosure schedule where you're trying to shift risk to the buyer. It's exhausting. You're running your company at the same time you have a completely separate job that takes at least as much time trying to sell it. So that's number one, is sellers often say they just didn't appreciate how much time it takes. And the other thing that they tell us when we're sort of debriefing afterwards is make sure you know what you want to do after closing, because all of a sudden now maybe you get 6 months, maybe you get a year with the buyer. It's pretty rare that someone's going to be able to just walk away the day after closing. But what do you want to do with yourself when you're done? That's an important thing to think about.
So from the point of view of someone who handles business litigation, this legal documentation process that Mike is talking about is, we're not talking about boilerplate, and we're talking about critically important things, because the seller's going to have to make certain representations to the buyer. And I have spent a good part of my career dealing with litigation that has arisen based as a result of transactions. Right now, I'm defending sellers who are accused of financial fraud in connection with the sale of the business. There may be an employment or consulting agreement for the seller, and the next thing you know is the buyer throws them out of the company unceremoniously and doesn't pay them. You can have disputes about earnouts, promissory notes, all sorts of things. So if I could just throw in the work that Mike is doing to protect his selling client is just really important. And I think that people who have bought and sold multiple businesses have a greater appreciation for the importance than perhaps, the first-time seller.
Well, I'm sorry.
I was going to say absolutely true.
What I was just going to add, as both of you know, that this business that I'm in right now is my second employment business, and my first one were actually we sold about 20 years ago, and I was partners with I had partners with my father. I can tell you that the work that Mike, as Marc said, that's important, because you're right. You go in there with your especially, it was a great time for my father to get out. But for me, it was like, oh, here's an opportunity with this public company. They want me to come in for a certain period of time. And then all of a sudden you come in, and the next thing you know, a recession, which is the Gulf War recession, hit company. And all of a sudden the executives you're excited to work with are no longer with the company, because it's all about the shareholder price. And you're like, okay, a lot of things happen. So as Marc said, a lot of things happen, and it's important to protect yourself. So it's really great what you say, Mike, even though you might not want to think about it. That was something that got ingrained in my head by particularly my father. So it was really helpful for me post that to say, okay, this may happen, and it did.
Right.
Mike, could you speak briefly about the importance of having a team you're selling a business, or buying a business for that matter?
Right. It's really important. And this is where different types of clients really rely on us. And we have to have a discussion with someone who maybe hasn't done it before, or has only done really small transactions, that you want to get your team together early. And this is both your internal and your external team. The internal team is your critical support staff who are going to help run the business through the closing and beyond that for the buyer. You want to make sure that those folks are incentivized to stick around for the buyer, because what the buyer is buying is predictability, cash flow, return on their investment post-closing. And you don't want to find out that your CFO or your COO or your head of sales can just walk after closing and take with them the sale, the revenue that the buyer was looking to get. So the internal team is really important. And here it really needs to be documented with a combination of carrots and sticks. Carrots being, look, if you stick around after a transaction, then you'll get X dollars. If you stick around for 6 months after the closing, let's say, you get an additional slug of cash. So you've incentivized them to stick around through a transaction. Now, obviously, you have to determine who on your internal team is going to know about the deal. And a lot of sellers who've never done this before think they can do it themselves and not tell their team. That's probably one of the first illusions that people have to give up once this thing gets going. You simply can't not let your CFO know what's going on when spreadsheets and reports from all over the place are being requested. And your operations people, you start asking for copies of your critical customer contracts and find out that, there is no contract with your customer they can walk. So that's the internal team. In terms of the external team, look, I'm, lawyers first. Of course, I'm lawyer centric, in part because you want to identify risks in your business, try to streamline processes and document them, including with your customers. Next on your external team is a good investment banker who can help shop the company and tell you what you need to hear in terms of growth, margin, how to be thinking about positioning yourself, where to put your resources. Third is going to be a really good accountant who can do tax planning, clean up your financial statements, get your turn on your receivables as low as possible, stop financing your customers, get better debt terms, fix your capital stack. And then lastly is your wealth advisor. Do you have somebody who has looked at different sales scenarios, what your tax obligations are going to be, how much you're going to net out of the sale, and is that enough for you to support you for the rest of your life for what you want to do?
Great.
Very important stuff, Mike. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yep.
Obviously, this is a conversation that we could talk about for hours, because it's extremely important to business owners, and we'll have to have you back on the show, Mike. But if any business owner or entrepreneur out there listening or viewing wants to get in touch with you and find out more themselves, what's the best way for them to reach you?
You can reach me by email. I am at Tarlow, Breed, Hart, and Rodgers, Radin at tbhr-law.com. Just mention that you heard me on this program, and I'd be happy to respond. A phone call is always best, just a chance to open the dialogue. And one of the things that's important is you want to have a lawyer and part of your advisor team not just tell you what they think you want to hear. You want them to sort of tell it to you straight. They shouldn't waste your time or theirs.
Great. I want to thank you again for joining the show. Of course, that was Michael Radin, partner at Tarlow, Breed, Hart, and Rodgers.
Thank you, everybody.
And of course, also from Tarlow Breed, we've got Marc Furman. Marc, if people want to reach you.
I can be reached at 617-218-2025. My email address is mfurman, Furman, @tbhr-law.com.
Great. And last but not least, Marc Z Legal Staffing. How can people reach you?
Thanks, Nathan. First of all, I want to thank again Mike for some great suggestions and comments, and Marc, great questions. As far as myself, you can Google Marc Z, M-A-R-C and the letter Z, or marczlegal.com, marczlegal.com, and 617-338-1300.
Great. Thank you. And of course, both Marcs are on our show regularly for segments almost every single week. So you can find them on radioentrepreneurs.com, as well as YouTube, Spotify, LinkedIn, and a whole host of other sites that we stream on. I want to thank our listeners and fans last, of course, and we'll be back with another segment on Radio Entrepreneurs.